Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on one of those fog-drenched December evenings, when the gas lamps of London barely managed to pierce the swirling mist, that I found myself seated across from Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. He was engaged in one of his many peculiar experiments, his long fingers carefully adding a dark liquid to a bubbling vial, his sharp gaze fixed upon the reaction with the intensity of a scientist unravelling the secrets of nature itself. I sat with a book in hand, though I confess my attention was not on its pages. Instead, I observed my companion. There was an unmistakable restlessness in his manner, a quiet dissatisfaction that I had learned to recognise as the prelude to one of his periods of profound intellectual boredom. A lack of stimulating cases had left him adrift, his brilliant mind yearning for a challenge worthy of his talents. As the liquid in the vial turned an ominous shade of green, he sighed and leaned back. "A trifling matter," he murmured, shaking his head. I had hoped for something more conclusive. Alas, chemistry, like crime, does not always yield immediate results. At that precise moment, a sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Mrs. Hudson, ever efficient in her duties, appeared at the threshold, a flicker of curiosity in her kindly eyes. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "She refuses to give her name." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Intriguing. Show her in." The woman who stepped into our sitting room was a striking figure, though not in the conventional sense. She was tall, her frame wrapped in an elegant yet outdated crimson dress, its deep red hue a stark contrast against the pale complexion of her face. A thick veil concealed most of her features, but her posture betrayed a tension that did not escape Holmes's notice. What struck me most, however, was the single red rose she clutched in her gloved hands, an odd and deliberate choice, given the season. It was fresh, its petals unfurled in full bloom, as if plucked that very morning from some hidden greenhouse. For a long moment, she said nothing. Holmes, too, remained silent, his piercing gaze drinking in every detail of her presence. Then, with a voice tinged with hesitance, she spoke. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I'm in need of your help. There is a matter of great importance, and I fear—" She hesitated. "I fear I am already too late." Before she could say another word, Holmes raised a hand. "You will, of course, allow me a few preliminary observations," he said, his tone light, but his expression sharp. The woman stiffened slightly. "Observations?" Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes fixed upon her hands. "You are a woman of education. Your speech and posture betray an aristocratic upbringing, yet you have ink stains on your fingers. That suggests a habit of writing or correspondence conducted in secrecy, as no lady of your standing would be so careless in broad daylight. Your slight tremor indicates distress, though not necessarily fear. No, this is the anxiety of one who carries a burden she cannot share. And then there is the matter of the rose." He gestured toward the flower she held. "Fresh, despite the winter chill, carefully chosen. A symbol, I presume." The woman's grip on the rose tightened. "You see much, Mr. Holmes," she murmured. "I see only what is there to be seen," he corrected, The question, however, is what you choose to tell me in return." She exhaled, as if resigning herself to the inevitable. "Very well," she said, "but I must warn you, the truth I bring may not be one you wish to uncover." Holmes merely smiled. "Madam, those are the only truths worth pursuing." The woman seated before us carried herself with the poise of nobility, yet there was an unmistakable shadow upon her countenance. Lady Eleanor Fitzroy, daughter of the late Lord Reginald Fitzroy, had the bearing of one accustomed to privilege, but her eyes betrayed a deeper unrest. She sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap, as if forcing herself to maintain control. For a moment, she hesitated, her lips parting and closing again, as though uncertain where to begin. I had seen many a troubled client cross our threshold, but few so evidently at war with themselves. There was a weight upon her, something she wished to divulge, yet feared to put into words. Holmes, meanwhile, regarded her with the calm detachment of a surgeon preparing for an incision. His long fingers steepled, he observed her as one might examine an unfamiliar specimen under a microscope, without a trace of sentiment, but with the keenest interest. "You are safe here, Lady Fitzroy," he said at last, his voice measured. "I believe you have come seeking answers. And yet, if I may observe, you have not quite decided whether you truly wish to know them." She exhaled, her resolve seemingly hardening. "Mr. Holmes, I have come because I fear that my father's past has risen from the grave, and I do not know if I am prepared for what it may reveal." Holmes gave a slight nod, as though he had expected nothing less. "Then, madam," he said, "let us begin with the facts." Lady Eleanor drew a breath, then began. "For as long as I can remember, every December 15th, a single red rose has been placed upon my father's grave in St. Bartholomew's Cemetery. No note, no name, just the flower." Holmes remained motionless, his expression unreadable. "A quiet tribute," he murmured, "not altogether uncommon. And yet, this year, something changed." She nodded. "Yes, this year, alongside the rose, I found a note. The message was brief, but chilling." She lowered her voice as she recited the words from memory. "To the man who knew too much, your sins are not buried with you." The room fell silent. Even I could not suppress the slight shiver that ran down my spine at the ominous phrase. Holmes tapped his fingers lightly against the arm of his chair. "Fascinating," he said, more to himself than to us. "A tradition carried out with quiet reverence, disrupted at last by accusation. And tell me, Lady Fitzroy, does your father have sins worth unearthing?" A flicker of something, guilt, uncertainty, passed across her face. "I do not know," she admitted. "There were whispers, of course. My father was a powerful man with many dealings beyond the public eye, but I cannot say whether he wronged anyone so grievously as to warrant such a message from beyond the grave." Holmes studied her for a long moment. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." And with that, the case had begun. Lady Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the folds of her dress. "There were whispers," she said at last, "rumours that my father's affairs were not as respectable as he made them appear. I never paid them much heed, until now." Holmes made no comment, but his sharp gaze remained fixed upon her, his long fingers tapping soundlessly together. She exhaled. "My father was a man of great influence, Mr. Holmes. He moved in circles that few had access to, government officials, foreign dignitaries, even certain questionable associates." She glanced at me, as if uncertain how much she should say in front of a doctor rather than a detective. Holmes gestured for her to continue. There was an incident many years ago, she admitted. A dispute over an inheritance, one that was never fully resolved. Some believed my father manipulated the outcome to his advantage. Others claimed there was an illegitimate heir, denied his rightful claim, but no proof ever surfaced. And yet, Holmes murmured, someone remembers. She shuddered. You think this is blackmail? Holmes tilted his head slightly. Blackmail is a possibility. So is revenge. The question, Lady Fitzroy, is whether your father's past has merely returned to haunt you, or whether it was never truly buried at all. Holmes had listened with an air of detached curiosity, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. But I, who had spent years at his side, knew when the great detective's mind was piecing together a puzzle before it had fully formed. His eyes lingered on Lady Eleanor's hands. Small movements, barely perceptible, yet betraying tension. The way she had hesitated when speaking of the inheritance, the way she had glanced toward me before revealing certain details. These did not escape him. You are troubled, Lady Fitzroy, he said at last. And yet I suspect it is not merely by the note left upon your father's grave. There is something you are not telling me. She flinched, if only slightly. I have told you everything. Holmes smiled faintly. No, you have told me everything you wish me to know. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his gaze unwavering. But you see, Lady Fitzroy, the truth has a way of surfacing, and I believe we shall find that it has already begun to rise. A silence fell over the room, heavy with unspoken words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lady Eleanor murmured, "What must I do?" Holmes straightened. That, madam, is what we intend to discover. There are few places more unsettling at midnight than an old cemetery, and fewer still when one is actively searching for signs of the dead refusing to be forgotten. The air was thick with mist as Holmes and I made our way through the winding paths of St. Bartholomew's, our footfalls muffled by the damp earth. The gas lamps at the gates did little to pierce the gloom, their flickering glow swallowed by the darkness. Holmes strode ahead with his usual determination, his coat drawn tight against the chill, while I found myself glancing at the looming gravestones with a vague sense of unease. A charming evening stroll, I muttered, rubbing my hands together. I do hope our spectral correspondent appreciates the effort we are making. Holmes did not pause. Ghosts do not write notes, Watson, he said lightly. Nor do they leave roses in December. There is a very real hand behind this affair, and I mean to discover it. At last, we reached the Fitzroy family plot. By the dim light of my lantern, we saw it, a single red rose placed with deliberate care upon the weathered stone. Beside it, a slip of paper fluttered faintly in the cold breeze. Holmes bent down, plucking it up between two fingers, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he murmured, "Fascinating." I leaned in, reading the message once more. "To the man who knew too much, your sins are not buried with you." Holmes straightened, tucking the note into his pocket. "Come, Watson." This message was not left without purpose, and neither was it left without a trace. With that, he turned sharply on his heel, his mind already racing ahead of us into the mystery that lay before him. Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows upon the walls, but he had no interest in its warmth. Instead, he had cleared a space upon the table, his magnifying glass in hand as he carefully examined the note beneath its lens. I watched as he ran a long, slender finger along the edge of the paper. "Good quality," he murmured. "Not a common stationery, but one of refinement, the type preferred by private correspondents rather than businesses. Do you observe anything else, Watson? I peered closer. The ink is slightly smudged at the end, I said, pleased with my own observation. A hurried hand, perhaps? Holmes gave the faintest smile. Possibly, but note the angle of the letters. The writer is left-handed. See how the ink pools slightly on the downward strokes. A right-handed writer would not produce such an effect. I nodded, conceding the point. A left-handed writer with refined penmanship who smudged the ink in haste. Perhaps he feared being discovered. Holmes tapped the note against his fingers. Or hesitated before finishing his message, he mused. A nervous hand, but not an unskilled one. The writer is educated, but uncertain. Now, the question is, uncertain about what? He set the note down, his gaze drifting toward the fireplace, lost in thought. Then, with sudden resolve, he stood. This is not a mere warning, Watson, he said. It is a confession in disguise, and I intend to find out precisely who has chosen to make it. Holmes sat in his chair, the note resting between his fingers, his eyes distant as he turned over the possibilities in his mind. I knew better than to interrupt him in such moments. My role, I had learned, was to provide the necessary facts while he performed his remarkable mental calculations. There were always whispers about Lord Fitzroy, I began. Men of influence often find themselves entangled in affairs best left undisturbed. His connections within the government were no secret, but some claimed he was involved in dealings far beyond what was publicly acknowledged. Holmes gave a slight nod, as if this was already expected. There was talk, I continued, of a disputed inheritance, a legal battle that never quite surfaced, but which those in high society knew of in hushed tones. Some believed Lord Fitzroy had an illegitimate heir, one kept from claiming his rightful place. Others dismissed it as mere gossip, but this note, Holmes, could it be that such an heir truly existed? Holmes tapped the note against his palm. If so, Watson, then it is most interesting that he, or someone acting on his behalf, has chosen now to make himself known. I leaned forward. There was also a woman, I added, a name never spoken aloud in polite company, but one that trailed Lord Fitzroy like a shadow. She was seen with him on more than one occasion, though no one dared question their association. Some said she was merely a confidant, others something more. Holmes's eyes sharpened. A woman whose name is known, yet unspoken. That, my dear Watson, is where the truth so often hides. We must uncover it. He rose from his chair, his energy restored. I believe it is time to pay a visit to someone who might remember more than they ought to. We had barely stepped out of the cemetery when Holmes came to a sudden halt. He turned his gaze toward a lone figure tending to the graves, a man in a thick coat and rough gloves. "Good evening, Mr. Clancy," Holmes called, startling the gravedigger, who blinked in surprise. "How?" he stammered, glancing at me before returning to Holmes. Holmes gestured lightly. "The scent of pickled herring clings to your coat. An uncommon choice for dinner, but a personal favourite of yours, no doubt. The remnants of grave dust on your left sleeve suggest you have been working late, though not quite enough to miss a meal." The man gawked, then gave a nervous chuckle. "Aye, well, you've got the right of it." As we walked away, I shook my head. "Holmes, you could have simply asked him what he had eaten." Holmes smirked. "Where is the satisfaction in that, Watson? A deduction must have flair, else it is merely an observation." He paused, tilting his head toward the sky. "Rain within the hour." I frowned. You deduce that as well? Your cuffs are damp at the edges, he said. The moisture has risen, though the ground is dry. The air is thick, the pressure low. A storm is approaching. And as we made our way through the darkened streets of London, I could not help but marvel, as I always did, at the man beside me. It was the following morning when Lady Eleanor's urgent message arrived, summoning us to the Fitzroy estate. Holmes read it with an arched brow, then tossed it onto the breakfast table. It appears our elusive correspondent has decided to alter his method of communication, Watson. Intrigued, we made haste to the Fitzroy residence, where Lady Eleanor met us at the entrance, her expression taut with unease. Without a word, she led us through the grand hall and into the gardens at the rear of the house. There, at the base of an old stone fountain, lay another red rose, identical to the one left upon her father's grave. A folded note lay beside it. The cemetery was not enough, it seems, Holmes mused as he retrieved the paper. He unfolded it carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the words. Fascinating. This time, the message is far less cryptic. I peered over his shoulder. The note contained but 3 words. I will be heard. A bold shift, I remarked. Whoever is behind this has decided to escalate matters. Holmes nodded. It suggests a growing impatience. The anonymity of the cemetery offered a degree of detachment. This, however, is an unmistakable challenge. The sender wishes Lady Eleanor to know they are close. Lady Eleanor's voice was steady, though I detected an underlying tremor. What do they want from me? Holmes tapped the note thoughtfully. Not money, I think. No demand has been made, no ultimatum given. This is not a plea, nor is it a threat. It is a claim. A claim? I repeated. Indeed. The question is, to what? He turned the note over, examining the ink with quiet intensity. And that, my dear Watson, is what we must now determine. By the time we returned to Baker Street, Holmes had already formed a hypothesis. Seated in his chair, fingers steepled, he spoke as if unravelling a puzzle whose edges he had long discerned. Margaret Henshaw, he said. The name appeared in the Fitzroy household records, did it not? I frowned. She was a housemaid in Lord Fitzroy's service, but she left shortly after his death. Why does she interest you? Holmes smiled faintly. Because she did not simply leave, Watson. She vanished. With characteristic efficiency, Holmes dispatched a series of inquiries to his usual network of informants. By midday, a reply arrived. Margaret Henshaw had not been seen in polite society since the passing of Lord Fitzroy. No acquaintances recalled her departure, nor did any employment records list her name after that date. It was as though she had ceased to exist. That, Holmes murmured, is far too convenient. By evening, his efforts bore fruit. An address, a modest lodging house in Whitechapel. Without hesitation, Holmes reached for his coat. Come, Watson, we have an old acquaintance to pay a visit. As we stepped into the cold London night, I could not shake the feeling that we were drawing ever closer to a truth that had long remained hidden in shadow. The lodging house in Whitechapel was a dreary affair, the sort of place where forgotten souls faded into obscurity. Holmes and I climbed the narrow staircase, our boots creaking against the worn wood, until we reached the door of Margaret Henshaw. Holmes rapped twice. A long pause followed before the door opened a fraction, revealing a pair of wary eyes. A woman, once stately but now worn by time, peered at us with suspicion. I have nothing to say to you, she said at once. Holmes, unfazed, tipped his hat. Come now, Miss Henshaw. Surely you will allow us the courtesy of a moment's conversation. We are here about Lord Fitzroy. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might bolt. But with a resigned sigh, she stepped aside and let us enter. Holmes wasted no time. "You were in Lord Fitzroy's service for many years, were you not?" Margaret crossed her arms. "A lifetime ago. And yet you vanished upon his death. A curious decision for a woman with nothing to hide." She stiffened. "I left because I had no place there." Holmes studied her closely. "Or because the one person who needed you most was no longer protected." She turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead. "It was never meant to be known." "But it is known, Miss Henshaw. The truth has a way of surfacing." A long silence stretched between us before she exhaled sharply. "Very well," she said, her voice low. "Lord Fitzroy had a son he never acknowledged." I started. "An illegitimate child?" She nodded. "Born in secrecy, hidden from society to protect the Fitzroy name. And when Lord Fitzroy died, that child was left with nothing." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And now, Miss Henshaw, I suspect he is ready to claim what was denied him." Margaret swallowed hard. "Not out of greed, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "but out of justice. Margaret Henshaw's confession had given us a name, Julian Gray, a man who had spent his life in the shadows of his father's wealth and power." "The roses," I murmured. "They were not a threat. They were a tribute." Holmes nodded. "For years, Julian Gray has honoured his father's memory in the only way he could, by leaving a silent token of his existence, a son's love, unacknowledged." "But why the sudden change?" I pressed. "Why the note?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Because he has discovered something new, something that has turned quiet devotion into a demand for justice." Margaret hesitated before pulling a folded letter from her drawer. "Julian wrote to me 2 weeks ago. He found something among his mother's old belongings, a letter from Lord Fitzroy himself, in which he admitted his son's birth, but swore that Julian would never be allowed to claim his name. The betrayal was evident. The father Julian Gray had mourned for years had, in truth, cast him aside." I let out a breath. "He must be devastated." Holmes's fingers drummed against his knee. "And a man in such a state, Watson, is unpredictable." Lady Eleanor had assumed she was being threatened, but in truth, she was simply the first to be confronted with a truth too long buried. Holmes rose. "This is no longer about uncovering a mystery. It is about preventing a tragedy." Holmes wasted no time. Within the hour, messages were dispatched, instructions given. He moved with a determination that told me he had already anticipated every possible outcome. And yet, I sensed he was withholding something. "You have a plan," I said, watching him carefully. "But you are not telling me all of it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Come now, Watson. You should be accustomed to that by now." I folded my arms. "You expect a confrontation?" "I expect several," he corrected. "And I must ensure that when the final act is played, we control the stage." His words left me uneasy. "You believe Julian Gray is dangerous?" Holmes tilted his head. "A man who has had his past stolen and his future denied, who has learned that the father he honoured considered him an inconvenience. Tell me, Watson, how would you react?" I had no answer. Holmes retrieved his coat and hat. "There are still a few moves to be made before the curtain falls." He cast me a knowing glance as he opened the door. "The final act, my dear Watson, is about to begin." Holmes had chosen Lord Fitzroy's abandoned townhouse for the confrontation, a location steeped in history, filled with ghosts of the past. The house had remained empty since Fitzroy's death. its once grand halls now covered in dust and silence. It was, as Holmes put it, the perfect stage for a performance of truth. Messages had been sent. Each key player in this mystery had been summoned under different pretexts. Lady Eleanor believed she was meeting her father's long-lost heir. Julian Gray was told that a lawyer, acting on behalf of the Fitzroy estate, had information regarding his claim. Margaret Henshaw had been instructed to come under the guise of an old servant called to testify. The threads were drawn together, and at the centre stood Holmes, weaving his web. I watched him as he prepared, his movements precise yet unhurried. There was something in his manner, an anticipation, an excitement beneath the cool exterior that unsettled me. "You are enjoying this?" I remarked. Holmes smiled faintly. "A game of chess, Watson, is only worth playing when all the pieces are on the board." "And what role do we play?" I asked. Holmes reached for his pocket watch. "That, my dear Watson, depends entirely on what happens next." I frowned. "And you are certain this will not end in disaster?" Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "Certainty is a luxury we do not possess. But I have found that truth, once cornered, has a way of revealing itself." Before I could press him further, we heard the sound of carriage wheels outside. The first of our guests had arrived. Holmes turned to me with a glint in his eye. "And now, Watson, the curtain rises." The heavy door creaked open, and Julian Gray stepped into the dimly lit room. He was a man of striking presence, tall, dark-haired, with a face that bore the unmistakable traces of his lineage. His eyes, sharp and wary, flickered around the room, seeking the lawyer he believed he had come to meet. Instead, his gaze landed upon Lady Eleanor. For a moment, the air itself seemed to tighten. Julian's expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded. "I was told I would meet a representative of the Fitzroy estate," he said slowly. "But I find only you." Lady Eleanor, seated in the high-backed chair that had once belonged to her father, met his gaze with cool composure. "Perhaps, Mr. Gray, that is exactly who you should have expected." Julian stiffened. His fingers twitched at his sides, and I saw in him the struggle of a man caught between expectation and reality. Holmes, standing silently in the corner, finally spoke. "I believe, Mr. Gray, that you have come seeking answers, as has Lady Eleanor, and yet the answer to both your questions is one and the same." Julian's gaze snapped towards him. "And what, pray, is that?" Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite Lady Eleanor. "That the past does not remain buried as easily as some would hope." The silence stretched unbearably. Then Julian strode forward and took the offered seat. Holmes smiled. "Now shall we begin?" For a long moment, Julian Gray sat in rigid silence, his gaze locked onto Lady Eleanor. His expression was unreadable, though I noted how his fingers curled into fists, then slowly relaxed. It was not anger that gripped him, but something far heavier. "I expected hostility," he said at last, his voice measured. "But I see now that I was mistaken." Holmes inclined his head. "An expectation formed by years spent in the shadows, no doubt." Julian exhaled, and I saw in his face the weight of a life lived on the fringes of a name he could never claim. "I was not here to threaten you, Lady Eleanor," he said, "nor do I seek to take what is not mine. I only wish to be acknowledged." Lady Eleanor, still seated, did not flinch. Her posture remained regal, her gloved hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. "Acknowledgement?" she echoed. "For years I left the roses in silence," Julian continued. It was all I could do. My father may have denied me, but I never ceased to honour him. He swallowed, his voice faltering for the first time. Then I found the letter, the words written in his own hand. He knew of me, he knew. And yet, he chose to cast me aside. For the first time, Lady Eleanor's expression shifted. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Surprise? No. Something deeper. Julian's voice hardened. I wanted to know whether my father's family would stand by his decision, or if there was still a place for me among those who bear his name. A hush fell over the room, thick with the weight of truth laid bare. Holmes, watching closely, steepled his fingers. And now, Lady Eleanor, he said softly, the question is, what shall you say in return? The answer, when it came, was not what I expected. Lady Eleanor let out a quiet breath, then straightened in her chair. I knew, she said simply. Julian's brow furrowed. What? She met his gaze without hesitation. I knew about you, Julian Gray. I turned to Holmes in astonishment, but he merely watched, his expression unchanged. Lady Eleanor continued, her voice cool, but not unkind. When my father died, I came across traces of you. Letters, accounts, proof that he had hidden a secret that, had it been known, would have altered everything. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. I chose not to act immediately. Instead, I devised a test. Julian's hands clenched at his sides. The roses, the notes, yes. She inclined her head. I wanted to see what kind of man you were. If you sought revenge, if you demanded wealth, if you were the kind of threat my father had feared. But you were none of those things. Holmes gave a quiet chuckle. A fascinating strategy, Lady Eleanor. Deception, but with purpose. Julian's voice was quiet. And now that you have your answer? She studied him for a long moment. Then, at last, she spoke. Now, Julian Gray, we discuss what comes next. I sat in quiet reflection as the conversation between Julian and Lady Eleanor continued, now absent of accusation, filled instead with the delicate negotiation of long-buried truths. Holmes, ever the observer, watched with interest before rising to his feet. I believe our presence is no longer required, Watson, he murmured. As we stepped outside, I let out a slow breath. You knew, I said. You knew Eleanor had orchestrated this entire affair. Holmes smiled. I suspected. But you didn't stop it. He turned to me, his eyes gleaming with something that might have been amusement. Not every battle is won with deduction, Watson. Some require patience. And with that, he strode ahead, leaving me to marvel, once again, at the mind of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes stood before the assembled company, his expression as impassive as ever. His fingers toyed with the latest note, one of the cryptic messages that had led us here. He held it up for all to see. Let us begin, he said, with what should have been the simplest question of all. Who wrote the notes? Julian Gray tensed in his chair. Surely not. Not you, Holmes interrupted smoothly. Indeed, they were not. But nor were they written by a servant, nor an unknown adversary from Lord Fitzroy's past. No, the answer is far simpler. He turned, his gaze resting on Lady Eleanor. A silence fell over the room. Lady Eleanor Fitzroy did not deny it. It was you, I breathed. But why? Holmes continued, his tone as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. The ink, Watson. It was identical to that used in Lady Eleanor's personal correspondence. The handwriting, though carefully altered, bore the unmistakable flourishes of an educated woman. The messages were deliberately ambiguous, not demands, nor direct threats, but a test. Julian sat forward, eyes dark with unreadable emotion. A test? Lady Eleanor regarded him steadily. You have spent your life seeking acknowledgement, she said at last. I had to know whether you sought something more. Revenge, power, a claim to the estate. Her fingers curled lightly against the armrest. I had to know if my father's judgment had been correct. Julian's jaw tightened. And now that you do, Holmes interjected. Now, my dear sir, she has her answer. I turned to Holmes, still struggling to comprehend it all. You knew, I said. You knew before we even arrived. Holmes gave the barest of smiles. I suspected, but certainty, Watson, is best reserved for the final act. Holmes turned his gaze toward Margaret Henshaw, who had been silent throughout. Now, we come to you, Miss Henshaw, he said, his voice softer but no less piercing. You were the one piece of this puzzle that remained out of place. Margaret looked away. I have nothing to do with... Holmes held up a hand. Permit me, if you will, to tell you what I do know. You disappeared after Lord Fitzroy's death, yet you never truly left. You remained in the shadows, ensuring that nothing, not even Julian's existence, became a weapon against the Fitzroy name. Her lips pressed together. Not out of fear, Holmes continued. Not out of guilt, but out of loyalty. I frowned. Loyalty? Margaret exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. Lord Fitzroy was not a perfect man, she admitted, but he loved Julian's mother, and I could not let their story be reduced to scandal. She glanced at Julian, something unreadable in her expression. I stayed because I knew one day this moment would come. Watson, ever sentimental, let out a breath. And so, after all these years, you guarded a truth that was bound to surface. Holmes nodded. Not every mystery is one of crime, Watson. Some are merely the echoes of old decisions, waiting to be answered. Julian sat in silence, his expression unreadable. And now? He asked softly. Lady Eleanor straightened. Now, we decide the future. Together. Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. A rare case indeed, Watson, he murmured. One where justice is not dictated by law, but by the will of those left behind. And with that, the mystery of the red rose had reached its end. For a long moment, Julian Gray sat in silence, absorbing the truth that had unfolded before him. His hands, which had been tense upon the arms of his chair, slowly relaxed. The anger, the frustration that had driven him here, seemed to wane. Holmes studied him keenly. Your reaction, Mr. Gray, speaks volumes. Julian exhaled, his voice quieter now. And what does it tell you? That you are precisely what you claim to be, Holmes replied. A man who has spent his life in the shadows, not for any fault of your own, but because of the choices of others. You sought acknowledgement, not vengeance. A man bent on destruction would not have left roses. He would have left ruin. Julian's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Holmes continued, his voice calm, measured. When you discovered your father's letter, the proof that he had known of you, yet chosen to cast you aside, you did not lash out. You did not demand fortune, nor seek scandal. You merely wished to be seen. That, Mr. Gray, is not the mark of a man with sinister motives. A silence hung between them. Then slowly, Lady Eleanor Fitzroy rose from her seat. Her eyes met Julian's, unreadable as ever. For years, I believed my father's judgment to be absolute, she said. That if he had chosen to keep you hidden, there was reason for it. Her voice was cool but not unkind. And yet it seems I was mistaken. Julian's head lifted slightly. Then you acknowledge me? A pause. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, Lady Eleanor Fitzroy accepted the truth. Holmes, watching intently, allowed himself the barest of smiles. "There," he murmured, "lies the true resolution of this case." As we departed the Fitzroy estate, I found myself struggling to process the events of the evening. I had borne witness to deception, manipulation, long-buried truths, and yet no crime had been committed, no villain had been unmasked, no wrongdoing had been punished. I turned to Holmes, shaking my head. "You astound me," I admitted. "At what moment did you see through it all?" Holmes gave a quiet chuckle. "Before we had even begun, Watson." I stopped short. "You cannot mean that!" He clasped his hands behind his back. "Think, my dear fellow. Lady Eleanor's composure, the deliberate nature of the messages, the carefully chosen location of the final meeting. It was never about exposing Julian. It was about understanding him. She manipulated the game so thoroughly that even we became unwilling participants." He glanced at me. "And that, Watson, is a strategy I can only admire." I let out a sigh. "And yet, after all your deductions, after every layer of deception was revealed, the conclusion was not about crime at all." Holmes exhaled softly. "Indeed." For a moment, he was silent, lost in thought. Then, with a faint smile, he murmured, "Not all mysteries are about crime, Watson. Some are simply about the nature of the human heart." And with that, he strode ahead, leaving me, as always, to marvel at the mind of Sherlock Holmes. The carriage ride back to Baker Street was a quiet one. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. The fog had settled over London like a thick shroud, muffling the sounds of the city, lending an almost ghostly quality to the gaslit streets. I found my mind still turning over the events of the evening. It had been an unusual case, not for its complexity, but for its absence of crime. There had been no villain to unmask, no culprit to apprehend, only the revelation of long-buried truths and the delicate negotiations of wounded pride and forgotten bloodlines. I turned to Holmes. "This was not like our usual cases," I mused. "There was no real wrongdoing, no deception in the criminal sense, and yet you pursued it with the same fervour as any other." Holmes did not immediately respond. He remained still, his expression unreadable. At last, he murmured, "Not all mysteries, Watson, are written in ink and sealed with crime. Some are merely the echoes of past decisions, demanding to be heard." I studied him carefully. There was a rare quality to his tone, a softness almost that I was unaccustomed to hearing. As we stepped out onto Baker Street, the familiar sights and sounds of home greeted us. Yet, even as we entered the warm glow of our sitting room, I could not shake the feeling that this case had unsettled Holmes in a way that few others had. I poured myself a measure of brandy and sank into my chair, watching as Holmes resumed his usual position near the fireplace. The firelight flickered across his sharp features, but for once there was no triumphant glint in his eye, no satisfied smirk at a mystery neatly solved. "You are uncharacteristically quiet," I observed. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Because, my dear Watson, for once I find myself in possession of a truth that cannot be measured, dissected, or rationalized." I raised an eyebrow. "And that truth is?" He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tracing absent patterns along the armrest of his chair. "Human nature, Watson. Legacy, the ties that bind us, whether by blood or by choice." He paused. "I have spent my life untangling the logic of men's actions, reducing their motives to their simplest form. And yet, even I must concede that emotion remains the final, unsolvable variable." I could not hide my surprise. "Are you telling me, Holmes, that there exists matters even you cannot deduce. A rare smile ghosted across his lips. I am saying, Watson, that even the keenest of minds can falter when faced with the complexities of the human heart. It was an admission I had never expected from him. And for the first time, I wondered whether, in the quiet solitude of his own thoughts, Holmes ever pondered mysteries far beyond the reach of reason. Holmes reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a single red rose. He turned it between his fingers, studying it with the same curiosity he reserved for rare artifacts or perplexing clues. "Strange," he murmured. "A flower so delicate, yet burdened with the weight of meaning." He looked up at me then, his expression unreadable, yet touched by something almost melancholic. With a faint smile, he said, "Sentiment, Watson, is the one enigma even I shall never fully decipher." And as the fire crackled softly, I realized that for once, the great detective had encountered a mystery even he could not solve. Holmes remained seated by the fire, the red rose still twirling between his fingers. I watched as his gaze flickered over its petals, his expression unreadable. "You surprise me, Holmes," I admitted. "I had always believed you viewed sentiment as little more than a distraction. Yet here you are, pondering a case where emotion, not logic, dictated every action." Holmes exhaled, setting the rose on the table. A distraction? Perhaps. But even I must acknowledge that human nature resists classification. It is not bound by the rigid rules of deduction. He leaned back, his fingers steepled. Julian Gray sought truth. Lady Eleanor sought understanding. Even Margaret Henshaw, in her own way, sought loyalty. And yet all of them were trapped by a single, unquantifiable force. I frowned. "And that is?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "The past, Watson. The past is the one mystery we can never change, only uncover." I considered this for a long moment. Then, shaking my head, I said, "And yet, you still managed to untangle it." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Untangling is one thing, my dear Watson. Predicting how it will shape the future, that is quite another. What do you think? Did Lady Eleanor truly intend to acknowledge Julian all along? Or did Holmes's deductions force her hand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Enjoyed this mystery? Subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases and share this story with fellow detective fiction lovers. Until the next case, the game is always afoot.